So welcome to the February 2025 meeting of the sponsors, the Carbon Leadership Forum sponsor roundtable. And I want to welcome all of you this morning to our meeting. And we're going to hear from a few really interesting and very good-looking people. Um, we've got Aurora Jensen from our CLF staff. Aurora is going to be giving us a quick overview of a few standards that are really top of mind when defining project level LCA requirements for buildings and infrastructure projects. And she'll be comparing ASHRAE 240P to LEED version 4.1 for buildings and Envision versus the new South Wales measurement guidance for infrastructure. And then we'll have a few people from two people, I guess, from the California Nevada Cement Association, which has been a sponsor of CLF for the last, I think it's been 2.5 years, Nathan. So Tom is the executive director of CNCA, and he's involved with and oversees CNCA's regulatory and legislative efforts that focus on infrastructure and the environment. And then Nathan Forrest, who is the technical director of CNCA, and he supports all manner of agencies and designers, owners, and material suppliers by providing education and technical resources on cement-based solutions. And we'll also have Shana Kelly from KPFF. She is also part of that effort, and we'll be talking about sustainability and resiliency as well. So, and Nathan, Tom, and Shane, I'll let you introduce the subject, and then talk about your role in it and outcomes and publications and so on. So to begin with, Aurora, would you mind? Actually, I've got more people in the waiting room before I start the meeting seriously. I'm going to admit all of those folks. And I think we've got everybody in the room now. And I'll do my best to do a better job of noticing people in the waiting room and then letting you all in. So Aurora, why don't you go ahead and give us an update from CLF on a key work of the Carbon Leadership Forum is to review, critique, support, supplement, add to, and hopefully make better project level LCA requirements for buildings and infrastructure projects. LCA, a really crucial topic for us and for the industry, partly because it gives you in addition to giving you a whole life understanding of the building and its carbon impacts, highlights the upfront importance of embodied carbon in that whole equation. So Aurora, please take it over, and I'll go ahead and let in Margaret Montgomery.
Great. Can you see my screen all right?
Yes. Yep. We can see it.
Awesome.
It's beautiful and very yellow.
Great. As it should be here at CLF.
Yeah.
Great. So nice to see everybody on the call this morning. My name is Aurora Jensen. I am a senior manager here at CLF, and I've been with CLF for about 4 months, so I'm relatively new. My role here is basically focused on buildings scale research and policy. And this morning, I hope to talk with you all about the way that we thought about standards for building and infrastructure projects in some work we did for New York State recently. This project started in 2024 and runs through most of 2025 as well. And basically, our aim with this project is to support New York State in rolling out Executive Order 22. And this guidance will affect all state agency projects in New York State. We prioritize this project on CLF's docket of many things we can study because of its ability to influence buildings and infrastructure, as well as its influence in a key state, New York, where we hope to see more work happening in embodied carbon in the future. On this project, CLF was actually a sub to ARIP, and our primary role was really to develop a memo around guidance options. Some of the topics we covered in detail in this memo are on the right, and what we're going to focus on today is the guidance detail level, which really is how we thought about interacting with standards in the writing of this guidance. But just as an FYI, I did mention here all of the other areas of the memo that we aren't going to get into today. So we looked at applicability, which building and infrastructure project should be affected, the stage of assessment, so when this is occurring over the course of a design process. We thought through compliance methods, so whether it's a baseline comparison or looking at an absolute benchmark. We also thought through reporting methods, whether that's in a spreadsheet or some other reporting tool, and then details of what scope of assessment is covered. So that included impact categories, life cycle stages, the reference study period, and which elements in the project were covered. Some of the details at the bottom, like data sources and tools, biogenic carbon, salvage materials, these are some of the really detailed portions of our guidance that explored what we want to see in New York State's requirements as well. But today, like I said, we're going to focus on the guidance detail level, which is basically to what extent does this guidance adopt a standard that already exists? The three main pathways we thought through here were first creating customized guidance. Ideally, this guidance would be aligned with industry standards. We don't want to create something brand new that doesn't reference the existing standards, but it may just adopt portions of those standards and be written mostly by New York State and the consultants in this case, ourselves and Arup. The second option we considered was adopting a certification program. You can see here we're a bit vague about which version of LEED because LEED is under revision currently. So we thought about both V4.1 and V5, as well as Envision, which is a certification program for infrastructure. And we thought about adopting both of these certifications more outright in the New York State guidance. The third option we considered was adopting quantification standards. You may have heard of ASHRAE 240P for buildings that's currently under revision, as well as a standard you may not have heard of is New South Wales measurement guidance. And this is a really extensive document that actually is for an Australian context in New South Wales, but it's a really developed standard for infrastructure. To kind of step out for a moment, thinking about standards broadly, there are many layers to standards and the way this is kind of the landscape of things we considered in making this short list. International standards you may be familiar with are typically ISO and EN standards. These tend to be really broad and then have to be kind of tightly bound in when applied to buildings. ASHRAE 240P for building codes, we would also say fits in this category. However, this standard isn't finalized and published yet. It's still under revision, and that's expected hopefully this year, is my understanding. There's also specific regional requirements. These are generally versions of standards that have been written for a specific jurisdiction. So this includes Cal Green, for example. You may have heard of the mandatory provisions there having to do with embodied carbon, as well as the Vancouver bylaw, the Toronto Green Standard, and here the New South Wales guidance as well. And then the last layer of things we considered is really these voluntary standards, the certifications we talked about. That's LEED and ILFI. This includes things like AIA DDX, that program, or SE 2050. We made this map to kind of help explain to New York State in this case how we felt these standards really differed from one another. And I found this landscape and sort of axes to be really helpful in thinking through what standards are really good at and where their gaps are. So you can see left to right, we've identified standards that are for measurement only and differentiated that from standards that are intended for comparison, that really describe a baseline or a benchmark of some kind. And then on the vertical axis, we're describing whether a standard is really specific in detail or whether it's really open-ended and up to user discretion. And here's kind of the key standards we were looking at and where they fall. So you can see ASHRAE 240P and RICS are really only for measurement. Neither of those standards include a mechanism for comparison. However, they are specific in detail in our evaluation. On the right side, you can see all of these standards noted here are available for comparison. They have a mechanism of some kind that you could use to demonstrate compliance with a reduction. However, only Vancouver and New South Wales guidance would we say is extremely detailed and really constrains the way that the user performs buildings or infrastructure LCA. You'll notice that we quickly kind of tightened this list down for discussion in the conversation today. And I just want to quickly state why. So on the building side, the standards from this longer list that we really thought about adopting more seriously were ASHRAE 240P and LEED v4.1. It should really say v4.1, v5. We didn't actually look closely at RICS or the Vancouver guidance or the Toronto standard, largely because of regional differences here, as well as differences in the building type or the scope that these standards cover. So for example, ResNet is generally for residential projects, not as applicable to buildings broadly. For infrastructure, we considered Envision and the New South Wales guidance. And even though the New South Wales guidance is a different region, we did feel like it was pretty unprecedented in the level of detail it got into, and we thought it was worth consideration. All right, so to kind of close out here, I want to do a quick side-by-side between LEED v4.1 and ASHRAE 240P, which are the two standards we thought about adopting for the buildings guidance. You can see that LEED is voluntary, although when it's implemented in Cal Green, it is mandatory for certain buildings. This requires assessment at the design stage, and this standard enables comparison. This is different from ASHRAE 240P, which currently the applicability isn't specified because that standard would have to be adopted in jurisdictions to make that clear. And the standard doesn't currently enable comparison. So that's a bit of a gap in terms of how you would roll out a compliance mechanism in New York. However, what we like about 240P is that it's really specific in terms of scope. It's very specific about life cycle stage, which elements are covered, how to report biogenic carbon, and even the hierarchy of data that should be used in performing LCA. And this is different from LEED v4.1, which enables comparison, which is really helpful for a compliance standard, but leaves a bit more user discretion in terms of which phases of life are included, as well as what covered elements are included. Those are defined, but they're defined more loosely in LEED. And just as far as when you're a user working with this guidance, I want to note that it feels really different to have 10 pages of sort of more limited guidance for LEED. That's notably different than ASHRAE 240P, which is extremely detailed. And I would say remove some of the guesswork from a modeling perspective in pursuing this standard. However, it also means it's more involved and sometimes more complicated to implement until the tools sort of pick up this standard and integrate that into their the way that they're working. And to offer the same comparison for infrastructure, Envision is that certification program I mentioned. And this comparison is really similar to what we're seeing for the building side, where Envision is voluntary, you're intended to assess at design or construction. You actually have some flexibility there. And Envision enables comparison. It's pretty specific about life cycle stages, as well as which elements are covered. This actually takes an 80% of the total embodied carbon of an infrastructure project is intended to be covered. And that's similar to actually how it's handled in the New South Wales standard as well. The New South Wales standard is also married to kind of a policy document for how this standard gets implemented in New South Wales. And that policy document does include an applicability threshold, what scale of projects is affected. There's multiple stages of assessments that are described here, and there's sort of a medium level of detail we would see in terms of the baseline guidance for comparison. Similar to the buildings comparison, we would say the Envision standard is pretty light as far as the way that it describes its requirements. So leaves a bit open to interpretation there, versus the New South Wales measurement guidance is extremely detailed and comparative in nature. So in the end, for New York State, we have recommended a customized guidance, largely because of timing. So LEED v4 and v5 is basically still under revision, as well as ASHRAE 240P. And as you can see from kind of our back and forth analysis, the standards that tend to be more detailed often lack a mechanism for comparison. So it makes it difficult to adopt them whole cloth. So we are kind of piecing together parts of these standards in the development of the guidance, and we'll reference those standards throughout New York State's approach. This is still under development, so I would say this approach is subject to change, But we just wanted to share that kind of reflection on our projects and the way that we're thinking about these guidance standards with this group. Any questions? I also have some questions for all of you, if not.
Now, if you've got a question, feel free to either raise your hand in Zoom or just go ahead and speak out, and we will not object to that at all. So, Aurora, you've got questions for us.
I
Hi,
do.
Andrew. This is Tiffany. I have one question. I'm sorry. I've been at ASHRAE and we just wrapped up, so I started a little bit late. Did you look at ACI 323 low carbon concrete code at all? The new code?
Yeah,
Okay. I
we're
just
familiar with that standard, but I think because of the scale of this guidance addressing a full project, it wasn't a standard we looked closely at for this. But I'm interested in your thinking.
okay, well maybe we can catch up later because yeah, reach out to me. I'm
Okay,
with
cool.
MCA. So
I'll just make a note here that the rest of this conversation this morning is mainly going to be about ACI 323.
yeah.
We're going to be hearing and thinking and talking a lot more about that standard. And so why don't you go ahead, Aurora, and ask the questions that you had, and then we can kind of move around toward 323 in just a minute.
Yeah, sure. So some of the questions that were coming up from us are just curiosity about how these standards are or aren't showing up in all of the work that this group is doing, and what level of detail you all are seeking in these standards. Some of the priorities that CLF sees is we want to see more guidance on baseline definition, on how biogenic carbon is accounted for, how to account for things like reuse and phases of life. And so those are some of our priorities, for example, and just curious what this group is thinking. And then the last question we had here is around City of Vancouver's guidance. It has one of the most developed definitions of a baseline that we've seen, both for key materials and assemblies, and really what you can take credit for in that comparison. So we basically recommended sort of addressing and building out this type of table for the US context, and are just curious on
Mhm.
thoughts or responses on that.
And if you've got a response or an additional question, please go ahead and feel free to either speak up right now, or you can put your question in the chat window and we'll read it there.
I see also Ryan's question in the chat. My understanding is the same as yours, that it's still in draft form, and I can't comment on the schedule, not being part of that committee. If anyone in the room is part of that committee, though, and could comment, that would be wonderful. I know it's a point of much contention and excitement.
Yeah. I am not on that committee, but I'm part of the MVP 2040 steering committee, and we've been tracking from the point of MVP 2040. We've been tracking and engaging in that process in ASHRAE, and I know that it is still in draft. I know that I believe it's supposed to be released at some point in the next few months, but there may be somebody else on this call who knows more than I do about that.
Okay, since it's quiet, I'll ask one. Or I'm just curious, not one of your three discussion questions, but that came up related.
That's welcome.
How did you? One of the things that we have seen come up related to I think to all these, but certainly Calgreen, is the review process, ability, understanding. Like you might ask someone to do something, right? But then how would the owner or the client know what they got? And how is that considered in the process of the recommendations?
I want to restate your question to make sure I understand. So you're wondering about, these standards may be written out in some kind of guidance that an owner then asks a consultant or a team to comply with. And you're wondering, how do you ensure that that's actually happening on the ground?
I think yes. I think because we have the frameworks and we say that we'll do this. I think there's in the evolution of this, there's a lot of different levels of comparison and study, all of which result in a number, right? But then that
Yeah.
transparency and understanding what's going on. So one step would be saying, how do we have that transparency in the checking?
Yeah, definitely. I think we covered this to some extent in the reporting approach part of the guidance where we thought about ideally New York State would have a reporting template that is pretty specific about which life cycle stages are included, how is biogenic carbon reported, how is reuse being reported. So ideally, in filling out that form, you are checking off and confirming the methods that you're complying with. However, I think we'd also love to see a process in the future of greater, almost top-down QA/QC for these kinds of results, and ability to understand whether something is in a reasonable range compared to other LCAs that have been performed. There are other ways of flagging, basically, especially when looking at baseline and proposed results side by side. It's possible to kind of use quantitative checks to identify things that don't make sense or suggest that you are out of compliance in some way. But I think those tools are yet to be developed yet, and I've heard of others working on them too outside of CLF. Other thoughts from the group on that? I know you have a lot on your agenda, Andrew, too. So if you want to move along,
Right.
please do.
All right. Well, let me just say that first of all, thank you very much for that overview, Aurora. Really appreciate it. And as people are continuing to think about the questions that you raised, feel free to put your question in the chat window, and we can come back to Aurora a little bit later in this hour if we've got a bit of time. So why don't we go ahead and move now on into a discussion of so this is the rest of this conversation is about the American Concrete Institute, which has released ACI code 32324. And that's a low carbon concrete code with requirements and a commentary. It's intended to be adopted as a standalone code or used in combination with a structural design code or a low carbon material code by some authority having some jurisdiction. So with that as kind of an intro, we've got both Nathan and Tom from the California Nevada Cement Association, and also Shana Kelly from KPFF, who worked on or rather chaired a sustainability committee that has a new appendix on sustainability and resiliency for that code. So I'll leave up to you guys, Tom and Nathan and Shana. You decide who goes first, and you probably already got that figured out.
Well, should I jump in?
Oh, yeah. And by the way, I'm supposed to let you share your screen, aren't I? So hold on just a second here.
Yeah, Nathan will be the one sharing the screen.
All right. Nathan, you can now share your screen, and I'll make you
Go ahead, Tom. I'll get that started.
Sure. I'll just give everyone a quick introduction to the California Nevada Cement Association. And by the way, Andrew, I love the way you kicked off this meeting. The California Nevada Cement Association has been active in the California's cap and trade program since its inception. As the executive director, I focus largely on the cement side of the equation. Back in 2021, we came out with our own carbon neutrality plan, which was different than the ones you see at the national level, but largely focused on how cement can be decarbonized in the state of California. And we were a big part of the language in Senate Bill 596, which is the first sector-specific piece of legislation, first net zero sector-specific bill in California history, aiming to have the cement consumed in California hit net zero by 2045. But while I'm doing all of that, Nathan is very much involved directly in the market. So he's interacting with architects, engineers, contractors, and agencies, both at the state level and local level. And because of his engagement on things like local low carbon concrete codes, he was the perfect kind of guy to be involved in the development of this ACI 323 code, which he'll be talking about. And thank you for this opportunity this morning.
All right. Thank you, Tom. As we get going here, a couple small housekeeping things. I want to first acknowledge Tiffany Reed Villarreal with NRMCA and Shayna Kelly with KPFF, both co-committee members of mine. I'm happy to have them here today, help keep me honest as I talk about this code here with everybody. A couple of other things I want to mention. I'm going to be going through this relatively quickly. I normally would spend 30 to 45 minutes talking about this topic, but I want to be respectful of everybody's time today, especially with Shayna Kelly with some upcoming information on the 318 code that she'll talk about. And I'm also going to point out that I've made some large assumptions about the audience today, namely that this audience knows what carbon dioxide is, that it's a global warming potential gas, understands the need for reductions, understands what environmental product declarations are. Those are things that I normally would cover in a presentation like this and have omitted for the sake of brevity and again, because I think this audience understands what those things are.
Can I
So,
just say amen, hallelujah?
thanks, Andrew. So I'll talk a little bit about why American Concrete Institute wanted to put this together. They looked around and saw that other agencies were working on things like this, right, at the federal level and at the local level. Folks like Marin County, folks like Cal Green, and not that they didn't consult with the cement and concrete industry, but those were, codes and guidance documents that were developed kind of externally from the concrete industry, and it was realized, in my humble opinion, a little late, that ACI needed to take a leadership role in this and develop their own. And so rather than, seeing folks continue to copy others' homework, they said, hey, let's look at what, the concrete industry can do. And this final bullet here, TAC is the Technical Advisory Committee at ACI. They came out with some information for the committee to consider on what they would consider low carbon. And essentially they said, in no uncertain terms, that there will not be an ACI document out there that suggests that anything called low carbon in their name would be at or greater than 100% of an existing benchmark. So that was a kind of a guiding tenet as this came together. Came together very quickly. The group was recruited in late 22 and spring and kind of over the winter into 23. Had our first meeting at the ACI convention in San Francisco in April 23. Worked very hard on it, and the document was published in October of 2024. I believe that's probably a record for publishing an ACI code document. A couple of key provisions that I'll mention in here so we don't lose sight of it. The provisions in this code are in addition to those that are the governing codes, like ACI 318, like International Building Code or International Residential Code, or whatever. And there's also a provision in here that I think will appeal to this audience. The licensed design professional can specify more stringent requirements than what's in the code, right? The code, as all codes, is a minimum. Some important things to realize here, that graphic on the right side, we're limited by the data that we have, right? It's not as robust as the data that we want. And that's why this code doesn't apply to those concretes listed at the top there, over 8,000 PSI, under 2,500 PSI, precast, augercrest, shotcrete, etc., because we just lack the data to be able to consider those. We remain hopeful that in future editions of this code that we're already beginning to work on, that we'll be able to improve on that. But for now, we're somewhat limited by what's available in a robust data set. I'll mention this group will understand that the code only considers the upfront carbon, the A1 to A3 in the LCA modules. And it uses, among other things, a carbon budget approach, which is very, very important. And you'll see why in an example that I'll walk through later on here. I want to mention as well that the code calls for the benchmark to be determined by the AHJ, or the authority having jurisdiction or entity adopting this code. That's important to realize because there have been some folks that have been somewhat mischaracterizing this code and suggesting that it relies too heavily on the NRMCA benchmark report that we'll look at briefly in a minute. And in fact, it calls for the agency adopting it to establish their benchmarks and to use the NRMCA code as a fallback position. So that's going to be important for a lot of places, that need to establish their own local benchmarks. And I'll talk about how to do that and what resources are available. The code breaks up projects into what we call tier 1, 2, 3, which essentially is large projects, medium projects, and small projects, and has different requirements for the size of project depending on the nature of it. For buildings, those breakdowns are at 5,000 square feet and under is considered a small project. Medium are projects between 5 and 50,000, and then large projects are over 50,000. And similar breakdowns for pavements, hardscapes, bridges, which are by deck area, and then other applications. ACI had done some research into figuring out where those breaks should be, and then the committee did some debating on it, and this is what we settled on. So the requirements for chapters 5 through 8 that cover those different project types are all very similar. And essentially, if you have a small project, you don't have a GWP limit. You do have a requirement to do a short narrative of any efforts that were undertaken to reduce the GWP of the concrete on the project. That was taken essentially from the GSA P100 document that has a requirement for that. If you have a medium project, or what we call a tier 2, there's an obligation to write that narrative and also to collect environmental product declarations for the concrete, but there's not a GWP limit. And then if you have a large project, you do have to demonstrate compliance with the GWP limits and reduction factors that are established by the local agency, which may be the NRMCA regional benchmarks, but maybe something else depending on what that agency adopts. I've mentioned a couple of times this benchmark report. This will be familiar to many folks in the audience. It breaks down the U.S. into 8 regions, and I would be the first to acknowledge this is probably not enough detail in the data, but it's what's available now. Good news is NRMCA, I believe, is very close to releasing a new version of this, which will break the U.S. down into 30 regions instead of 8, and also contain data for some specific metro areas. So the granularity of this data available is about to get a lot better. And then the 323 code will have to consider how that is used in a future edition of the code, the 323-2027, that we'll be working on in the very near future. I've already started working on it here. I'll give you a project example here in some very basic terms. I invented this project, so don't look too closely into it. It's for illustrative purposes here. So we've got an over 50,000 square foot project, so a tier 1 project. We're going to build this project in California, so it falls under the Pacific Southwest region, and the local agency didn't adopt their own benchmarks, so we're going to look at the NRMCA Pacific Southwest region, and when doing that, the code would call for an alpha factor or a carbon reduction factor of 85% of that benchmark. So this is the kind of information that the design professionals will be generating, various intended uses for concrete, concrete quantities, exposure categories, strength, whether it's lightweight, normal weight, water cement ratios, etc. As an aside, it would be really, really wonderful if the design professionals would give the concrete producers the information that they need in a table like this. It's extremely helpful for them rather than having to dig out the details from various appendices and footnotes and so forth. And then from the ready mix supplier, they would generate environmental product declarations with their global warming potential as shown in the right-hand column there in terms of carbon dioxide equivalents per cubic yard. This is a good place to mention that this code deals with CO2 intensities in terms of CO2 per cubic yard, whereas we'll often find environmental product declarations in terms of CO2 per cubic meter. So be careful with your units on that. You can get tripped up pretty easily. when we start to look at the GWPs as they compare to that regional benchmark report, we see that we've got a couple of them here that exceed the regional benchmark, and that's not a red flag, and you'll see why in a minute here. Further, when we look at these mixes and their EPDs as they relate to 85%, well, now we've got a third mix that exceeds the regional benchmark. And the reason that that's not a problem is this carbon budget concept that I mentioned earlier. When we take this sum total of carbon, the quantities of the individual mixes multiplied by their carbon intensities, and compare what is being submitted versus what is allowable, down at the bottom, we see that the total carbon for the concrete in the project is less than what's allowed. So even though we have a few mixes that are relatively high in their carbon intensity, we can see that the sum total of the project carbon is contract compliant or code compliant. And the way that the code suggests that you, or requires that you show this, is with some math here in section 4. This might look a little bit ugly, but essentially you add up your weighted average, the project's weighted average, compared to the allowable weighted average, and show that your GWP intensity is below that reduction factor that the code requires. So this is in fact a compliant project. And so what's next for the concrete industry? Well, clearly the sky is falling, depending on who you ask. The local benchmarking is very important, right? And when I talk to ready-mix producers, I talk to them about how they really need to participate in this. For the ready-mix operators that are in large metro areas, they probably are doing this already. And if your project is in a very large metro area, it's probably well represented by the regional benchmarks because they're highly, highly influential due to the relative maturity of the EPD market in those metro areas. For those that are in more rural areas, though, or are not in those large metros, they really need to participate in this and really need to, frankly, insist that any of the local agencies considering adopting a code like this establish their own local benchmark, because that regional benchmark may not be reflective at all of the concrete in a particular area. If they haven't already, they need to be working on environmental product declarations, and there's potentially some funding available from folks like the Portland Cement Association, National Ready Mix Concrete Association, etc. The ACI Code Advocacy Division will be out promoting this code with ASHRAE, International Green Building Code, International Residential Code, etc., others. In addition to that, ACI, under the auspices of NEW, which is the Center of Excellence for Carbon Neutral Concrete, is developing tools, training, outreach items for this to help these local agencies get on board with this. The chair of the 323 committee, Dr. Matt Adams from New Jersey Institute of Technology, is taking a sabbatical from his teaching profession of a year to work on this. And he's out on a big road show, of course, talking about this with everybody who will listen. And the last thing I'll mention here, the final bullet, is if you are an employee or know of any employees at government agencies that would like copies of this, ACI will give free access to this code for local agency staff members. Essentially, if you have a .gov email address, get in touch with me or with any of the other code committee members, and we will refer you over to the folks at ACI, and they'll get you free access to this code in hopes that it informs your decisions on low carbon codes. That's all that I have prepared. Hopefully that was quick enough for everybody, but I'm happy to take any questions that you may have.
Nathan, do you want to pause for questions and let Shayna
Yeah, let's pause here.
jump
Let's
in
take questions on 323 and then transition into Shayna's work on 318.
Okay, great.
All right, can you guys see my screen?
Yes, we can. It is
Okay.
beautiful.
All right. So I don't have enough time, I think, like Nathan said, to kind of go over everything that 318 is. But when I heard that Nathan was talking about 323, I wanted to make sure that we mentioned 318 as well, because they're two codes that are both by ACI. They both have sort of new things that are regarding sustainability, but they're different, but they look very similar. So I want to make sure that people sort of understand what those things are as they're sort of looking at ACI codes that are related to sustainability. So I have pictures up sort of on the screen of the two different codes. 323 is on the right, 318 is on the 323 is on the left, 318 is on the right, and they look the same, right? But in physical form, they're actually kind of pretty different. So this is the 323 code. It's very slim, right? And it's brand new. And so this one basically is one that is new. It just got published. And so in that case, it's not sort of adopted yet by AHJs. And so that's one that, you would have to have an AHJ or a structural engineer or an owner sort of adopting it in order for it to go into place. It covers many different types of structures, right? So there are different categories, as Nathan mentioned. And so it's whether it's a transportation structure or a building structure or a sewage treatment plant, all of those can be covered under 323. But it only addresses the sustainability aspect, right? So it only addresses that carbon. So anytime you have to look at the design of an element, it really has to have another sort of design code that it's kind of pairing with. 318 on the right side of your screen there, that's the historic concrete building code. So that's the code that we as structural engineers have been designing to for, 100 years or so. And so this is the code that is adopted by states, by cities, that through adopting the IBC. And so this is the code, and I'm going to show it here, is really thick, right? This is the one that sits on the desks of all of your structural engineers, and it's the one that they use on a daily basis to design concrete structures. And so if we look at the 318, so this one was just published just last month on online. It's going to be printed this month, so it's brand new. It will not be adopted until IBC 2027. So I'm going to talk about it today, but people are not actually going to start using it for a number of years from now. But the 31825 really sort of expanded what it had in terms of sustainability from what the code that we're using today. So that's why I wanted to just note this to you. So the code that we're using right now is 31819. And in terms of sustainability, it says you can do it, but we're not going to tell you how to do it. And so really sort of people kind of knew it was out there, but they didn't really know much about it. And so what 31825 does is it actually creates this whole new appendix that's about sustainability and resilience. And it's not mandatory, right? So it doesn't say you have to do sustainability. That's really important to note. So this big code that's going to sit on the structural engineer's desk, it's not saying you have to, but it says it shall be permitted. And what it does is it really creates that framework for defining sustainability and resilience on projects. And it also makes it so the engineers that are using this are really more comfortable with that concept, right? And they think about that framework being used. So there's a bunch of different sections. I don't have time to sort of kind of walk through all of them because I want to leave some time for questions here. But really, there's basically those sort of typical sections that are at the beginning, terminology and scope. But there's also more than 323. There's also a section about the evaluation of structural concrete systems. So I kind of always think in my head of this as the whole building LCA sort of section. There's a section on resilience and then the concrete mixtures. And that concrete mixtures section has a lot of overlap with 323, and it also references 323 within the commentary. So there's a lot of words on the screen, but basically in terms of looking at the sustainability of the structural concrete systems, we're really referencing ASTM. So no, we're not reinventing the wheel in terms of how to look at that. We're saying go to look at this other standard to do that. Resilience, there's a lot of sort of information, sort of background information about what different resilience standards are out there, but it doesn't say that you have to do it. There's also some discussion in there about the thermal mass impacts of concrete specifically. And then the concrete mixture section, as Nathan sort of mentioned, there are sort of these different, there's the GW limit section that's similar to 323, and then there's a couple other options for jurisdictions that may not have EPD information. Those may go away in the future as more jurisdictions have EPD information, but these are there for right now. And then again, we're referencing 323, but we're also going through and talking about that weighted average or that concrete budget approach. So since what does this mean for us as we're sort of as operating and as we go into this new code, it's not mandatory. So it doesn't mean that every project will change, but it does provide a framework for doing this on projects. So the idea is that in regions where this isn't typical, this will sort of get engineers and HJs sort of familiar with this concept of defining GWP, defining sort of sustainability aspects within projects. And so I think, there's a lot of new sort of resources from CLF, right? The new specs that are out there, and the concrete one that's in there does use that sort of approach of that weighted average. So that's a good way to sort of start thinking about how to be defining concrete in your specifications. And then the other thing I wanted to sort of note is that one of the things that I see most often when people are defining concrete is that they limit the cementitious material percentages. And that's driven by, there's this specific table within ACI 318, and this is 318.19 that I'm showing on the screen. And when you have a high exposure class with an F3, it specifically puts those limits on the cementitious materials. But those are really only for the case where you have de-icer and a freeze-thaw situation. So that's maybe a plaza slab or something like that. That's where you would want to be limiting it. But in reality, most of our applications, they don't have that. But oftentimes when people write their specs, they set these limits on SCMs for all of their concrete mixes, which basically hobbles your ability to lessen the GWP. So this is actually, those limits are going to go away completely in 318.25, but until we get there, I want to really make sure that people are only applying those limits to the F3 classification and only that one. And then the other really kind of new thing within 318.25 is that, we have rules that we have to follow when we design structures. And one of those rules is what can we use as cementitious material. So there's this table within 318 that we follow. And there are a couple of new categories within 318.25 that are coming. So ground glass pozzolan specifically. But I also want to make sure that people are really making sure that they're allowing type 1L. That's really sort of spreading out across the country. And that is specifically limited or specifically noted in this table. So I think that it's really important to make sure that your specifications are doing that. And that's it.
Great. Thank you so much, Shana. That was, and for all three of you, that was a great, comprehensive and detailed and intriguing set of presentations. We've got one question in the chat window from John Hall, who says, Nathan, your theoretical example project complied with the proposed code. Have you done something similar, looking at a few real projects to be able to advise clients on how big of a lift this really is, time, money, and so on? And then, of course, references, there are lots of low-hanging fruit options. And before you answer that question, Nathan, I just want to make a quick note, a little tiny hint of a set of resources that are going to be coming out within the next couple of weeks here. Don Davies, along with a task force that includes several other people, two of whom are on our call this morning, Dirk Kessner and Ann Ellis, created something called the Lower Carbon Concrete Task Force. And the task force has written a lower carbon concrete guide for practitioners, for designers, and also developed a set of 6 case studies, very specific case studies, with a variety of partners that use both innovative materials and designs and in real projects. And so my objective over the next few weeks is to nail down Don Davies and get him to come to this call next month to tell you all about those case studies and that lower carbon concrete guide with its guidance, which is very much related to this question. And Nate, while I've been talking, you've been assembling a great answer to the question.
Well, I don't know if it's a great answer. Thanks, though. So, John, thank you for the question. That's a really good one. I could probably talk about this at length. But what I would say is, one, yes, I have looked at some real projects. In order to make that easier, ACI has developed a calculator for this. It's in the first link that I put there, 323 calculator. You can essentially go in there and put in your quantities and look at your various GWPs, and it does all the math for you and makes a nice little kind of report at the end there. And what I tell folks, because as Tom mentioned, I spend a lot of time with architects and engineers and agencies, is that in where I work in the greater Los Angeles area, if a owner wants to do a 10 to 15% carbon reduction, that's like business as usual, right? It should be zero problem getting 10 or 15% below that benchmark. If you want to get to a 25% reduction, you need to make sure your specifications will allow that to work. Out of a lot of those things like Shayna alluded to, as far as SCM limits or cement limits, like minimum cements, um, those are often found in what I call legacy project specifications. It's really easy to copy and paste a spec, not that anybody would do that, right? And have something in there that says, well, this concrete needs a minimum of 575 pounds of cement and a maximum of 15% SCM. Oh, and I also want it to be low carbon. And it's real easy to have spec provisions that cannot coexist, right? So you've got to make sure that your specs will allow the concrete industry to produce that concrete, and also that that carbon budget approach becomes really, really important, because there are going to be parts of that project that are going to need higher carbon concrete for whatever reason, and you've got to allow the ready mix producer to move materials around it and optimize that. And then if you're trying to get even deeper into the carbon reduction, into that maybe 35 to 50% range, what I say is you really, really need to be collaborating with your owner, with the general contractor, with the concrete contractor, with the concrete supplier. The likelihood of the concrete producers having off-the-shelf mixes that'll do that and do everything that everybody wants is very, very low. So they're going to need time to develop those mixes in the lab, right? Some of these lab tests could take 6 months or more. And in addition, you better be doing mock-ups, trial pours, demos, things like this, because I can almost guarantee you that the concrete contractors are not used to those mixes, that the owners and the architects that are concerned about the aesthetics of the project are not used to seeing those mixes. And so you need to get hands-on with them and make sure that everybody's comfortable with the way they look and the way they perform and the way they behave, and with the aesthetics of the finished result. And all that stuff takes time, right? So the kind of the deeper you want to get into this reduction, the more time you better associate with it. And the second link that I put in there, Andrew, I heard you talking about the low carbon concrete guide. Really looking forward to that. And just I'll throw in there that the Portland Cement Association also recently produced a guide to low carbon concrete, free download at that link that I put in the chat. So it'll be excellent for folks to have lots of references and resources to look at for that as they work on that. And I see
Great.
a couple of hands up as well.
Thank you so much, Nathan. We've got just a couple minutes left, time for a couple of quick comments or questions. Kimberly, go first, and then Dirk, and then we'll be at the end of the meeting.
Hi, can you guys hear me? All
Yes.
right. Great. Hi. Thank you so much for the presentation. Just curious, with titles like sustainability and resilience, it seems like, and obviously this audience is very focused on embodied carbon and carbon reduction in general, but does that include a broader umbrella of sustainability, such as the health hazards of certain SCMs or the impacts from a wellness perspective? I'm just curious what the umbrella term of sustainability includes within those new standards. And if it's just focused on carbon, that's perfectly fine. I just wanted to know the definition.
Uh, Specifically in 323, the short answer is no.
Okay.
It does not look at anything essentially outside of upfront embodied carbon. And I don't want to step on Shayna. I know she's here with information on 318. Is there anything in the sustainability appendices, Shayna, to answer with this?
No, and I think Kimberly, that's a good question, and it was an item that we did actually have a lot of discussion, but it is at this point is focused on carbon, but I think there is a hope in the future to expand further.
Great. If it's all right with you, I'm hoping to get maybe in touch with both you and Nathan afterwards because we're conducting some research and it might be helpful to interview you guys at a later date. So
Please do.
cool. Awesome. Thanks.
Yeah, any of you all, just let me know if you need email addresses or a connection. I'll be glad to provide it. So, Dirk, go right ahead.
I'll be fast. I think confirmation, the default benchmark numbers are hard coded. They don't reference like the most current NRMCA. The question as
Correct.
these benchmarks come out, and then is there a provision for, I know others have a high early amplifier.
No,
How does
no, the
323
code
handle that?
the code doesn't address
Okay.
that. Yeah, I guess two parts. One, the code recommends the local agency establish their own benchmarks. It says, if not, then use NRMCA. And the 2024 edition of ACI 323 references the 2022 NRMCA benchmark, and it is static, right? And I mentioned that as NRMCA improves their regional average reports, then the 323 committee will have to figure out how to incorporate those to go forward.
Yeah,
Thank you.
as a code writing body, we have to set it in stone, right? What version we're referencing. But a AHJ could certainly say, I'm going to, as you know, adopt this new NRMCA as my benchmark.
Yeah.
Great. That sounds like a perfect wrap to this morning's extremely exciting conversation about concrete. And I'm being very serious here. All right, so thank you so much, all of you, for attending. We'll see you next month. Like I said, I'm going to try my best to get Don Davies on here to talk about the low carbon or the lower carbon. Why am I having a hard time saying this? The lower carbon concrete task force. I'm going to get it out, I promise. And in the meantime, you'll probably all be getting a link to that new resource when it's available. And thank you so much also to Aurora for providing us with that update on the CLS work related to this topic as well. And so we will see you all next month. Thanks so much for attending.
Thanks
Bye.
for the opportunity, Andrew. Bye, everybody.